Welcome everyone to CSI Skill Tree. In this series, we take a close look at video games to examine and celebrate the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich and thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eshrick. I work at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, and I'll be your host today. And we're going to talk about a game called In Other Waters, which is an adventure game about searching for a lost scientist in the oceans of an alien planet and unraveling the mysteries of the planet's aquatic ecosystems. This is the most recent game that we've done so far in this series. It was released in 2020, and it was designed by the one-person studio Jump Over the Age, which was founded by Gareth Damian Martin, an award-winning writer, designer, and artist who is based in London. Gareth is also the editor of Heterotopias, which is a fantastic online zine about games and architecture that everyone should check out. And In Other Waters is their first game, and they're currently working on a second, Project Sidereal, which is slated for release in 2022. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two guests who will help me unpack what makes In Other Waters so unique and thrilling and such an effective, technically grounded vision of the future. So first, I'd like to welcome Lisa Yin Han. Hi, Lisa.
Hey there.
Lisa is an assistant professor of film and media studies at Arizona State University, the same department where I did my undergraduate degree, actually. Her research is informed by her dedication to environmental and social justice, as well as her background in media production. And she's working on a book titled Benthic Media, Underwater Technology and the Taming of the Seafloor, which I'm very excited about reading, and which examines the social and technological history of media operations in deep ocean environments. She was also recently named a fellow for 2021-22 at ASU's Institute for Humanities Research. So congratulations on that, Lisa.
Thank you.
And second, I'd like to welcome Hilairy Hartnett. Hilairy, thank you for being with us.
Hi, Joey.
Hilairy is a frequent collaborator of our center, and she's a professor jointly appointed in the schools of Earth and Space Exploration and this, as well as molecular sciences at Arizona State University. Hilairy is an oceanographer and organic geochemist whose work focuses on the processes that transfer energy, as well as elements like carbon and hydrogen, or excuse me, carbon and nitrogen, I should say, between biological and geochemical systems. She investigates mechanisms that operate on a vast range of timescales, from days to millennia. And more recently, she's developing ideas and approaches for building consensus among scientists, technologists, policymakers, and others around planetary scale climate intervention. So two people who I think are just like uniquely well suited to help me untangle all the threads of this game. So again, thank you both for being here. We'll start by introducing In Other Waters in more detail, and we'll discuss the experience of play and the early stages of its narrative and how its distinctive look and feel is tied into its approach to storytelling and world building. And while we're doing that, we'll run a gameplay video in the background, just so you get a sense of the game. There's a lot of text and some small interface elements, which can be tough to see on the shared video screen. So I suggest you just try to let it wash over you and give a look at the color palette and sort of the pace of interaction. And Lisa, Hilairy, and I will help to contextualize what you're seeing a bit. And we definitely encourage you to pick up the game yourself and give everything a closer look later. You can find it on a bunch of different platforms, a few consoles, as well as Windows and Mac computers. So after that opening segment, we'll delve more into the game's themes and big ideas and how it connects to some of Hilairy and Lisa's areas of expertise, like ecology, astrobiology, aquatic tech, exploration, and the current situation of oceans here on Earth. Then we'll turn to responding to questions and comments from you. So throughout the conversation, anytime, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit a question or a comment. You don't have to wait until we're actually taking questions and responding at the end. You can do it anytime. So as soon as something occurs to you, please just drop it in there whenever. And thank you all so much for being here with us. I'm really excited about this. We're sort of kicking off a summer series of these Skill Tree events, and I'm really jazzed to dig in. So without further ado, let's get underway. Lisa, could you start while we're getting that gameplay video pulled up by telling us a little more about In Other Waters? Like, how does the story start off, and what's the experience of playing the game like?
Totally. So the basic conceit of this game In Other Waters is that you play an AI who is linked with a xenobiologist named Hilairy. And Hilairy Voss is a scientist employed by a company called the Baikal Corporation to find her lost colleague, Mine Nomura, who's doing some sort of research that you don't know entirely what it was on the oceans of a planet called Gliese 677cc. So genre-wise, it's, as you can sort of see from this video, it's largely a text adventure game. Joey, I think you called it an interface novel, which I thought was a good term, where you move around this cartographic map and take samples of new species as you're exploring and charting out this mysterious new planet. So some of the species are integrated into small puzzles that you can solve as you move through the space. So for instance, like there's one type of organism called a shrill sac, I think, that emits some sort of signal that makes other organisms retreat so that you can pass through blocked areas. There's organisms that can also be used as like oxygen reserves. So kind of in a more minimalistic way, it's similar to a lot of other adventure games where you're collecting and using things from around your environment to an extent. But the science is especially foregrounded. So you kind of get like a part detective story, part science simulation, part freeform adventure. The gameplay itself is pretty slow. You know, it's very exploratory. And as you're moving through this space, Hilairy Voss is communicating with you and taking notes and interacting with you to kind of roughly guide where you go and what you do.
I want to put a finer point on that, actually, that the point of view is actually kind of interesting in this game. It's a little finessed. The main character, I would say, is the scientist Hilairy Voss, but you actually take the form of this AI-powered suit that she uses to get around. I don't know what you thought of that, Lisa. I thought it was an interesting bit of kind of, something we'll get back to, but a bit of displacement in the game where you're slightly at a remove from the character and you're almost kind of in a conversation with Hilairy Voss, although it's a bit stripped down because you can't say much. You're often just saying yes or no.
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting aspect of the game, that you're put into the perspective of a non-human. But I think like later on in the game, you're sort of given more clues about what exactly you are. And that's integrated into the message of this game as well. I think this, you know, question about the boundaries between technology and, you know, human intelligence, other forms of intelligence. So, yeah.
What did you make of the experience of play, Hilairy?
So it's funny, you hit on exactly my favorite kind of game when you asked me to do this, and I didn't know anything about it when I started. It has sort of what I call a porthole view of the world, right? It's very much this kind of narrow window into what feels like something really vast. And you have to be very systematic about how you walk through the gameplay. And I was completely sucked in by it, right? I really enjoyed and I admit, I kind of felt like the boundary between Hilairy, the character, and the AI suit that you're driving was a little bit porous, right? You would occasionally kind of feel like you were making these decisions as Hilairy would make these decisions, but not exactly. It was very interesting.
Yeah, it gets to a kind of like idea of a cyborg main character in a way that like once you're so dependent on a technology to stay alive in this environment, like it's hard to kind of draw a clean line, I feel like, between the technology and the person riding
it's almost like Hilairy was so alone that Hilairy would talk to herself, and you were herself she was talking to.
Right. So I want to just stay on the game's kind of mechanics and sort of like experience just for another moment, deliberate on a little more, which is, you know, the way that this is. I did use, Lisa, this phrase of interface novel, which I doubt I made up. I'm probably quoting it from somewhere that I'm not remembering, but you know, you do see, and as you've seen everyone in the gameplay video that we've been running, you see a bunch of or I should say a small assemblage of interfaces, a control panel for the exploration suit, a bathymetric map, which was new to me. That term was new to me, actually. Lisa and Hilairy turned me onto that. You're seeing right now the underwater station that you sometimes go to and do some sample analysis and inventory management and other things, and learn more about the plot. That's where you can see this really well put together, I think, scientific kind of research note compendium / encyclopedia for the game, and really learn about the ecosystem. So I'm wondering what you two make of this kind of what I would call like a stripped down, heavily mediated approach to exploring an ocean. I think when we were talking about this game earlier, we were talking about how much it differed, not only from other video games that are set in the ocean, but also other kind of media experiences of the ocean, like documentaries and things like that, or museum exhibits, even aquariums that are like intend to be very immersive and very kind of visually overwhelming and sublime.
Yeah, I can just start by responding. I think this is a really gorgeous game. Like, it's obviously a very aesthetic game, but it's not photorealistic. You don't see any caves or reefs or shelves or any of that stuff. That all you really see is dots moving on a map, and the writing is so descriptive and evocative. It's like reading a science fiction novel. So your own imagination's constantly filling in the blanks there, especially later in the game. I think in terms of messaging, that turn to photorealism, or turn away from photorealism, is really important. Just because in the majority of the ocean media that, the popular media that we see here, we're socialized to care about the nature that we find beautiful, right? And so, like, because of the way that nature gets relegated to these defined, pristine images, these sort of tourist-informed image cultures, we're invested in these ideas of like this untouched, beautiful nature. But when it comes to the reality, right, of the Earth's ecology and human relationships, ocean ecosystems, there's a lot of nature that's also scary and ugly and strange and difficult to disentangle from human objects, infrastructures, and also nature that exists outside of what we can visualize and observe. So yeah, the game's privileging of a map, its refusal of those kind of crisp, colorful images that we associate with something like Blue Planet, or like existing ocean adventure games, even like Abzu or Subnautica, seems to have this important purpose for me of taking us outside of our usual limited perspective on nature and into something that is realistic in a different way. And I do want to mention the sound also, because there's an interesting sonic element. So I'm wondering if maybe Tyler wants to maybe play a snippet of the sound as well. So yeah, the sound here is like an interesting addition as well, because it does provide a sense of ocean ambiance. And the way that you're navigating is also seemingly based on sound, which is also reflective of the oceans themselves as sonic environments.
If I could just jump in a little bit, I really completely agree about the refusal of the photorealist sort of perspective. And it was only as I was listening to Lisa that it made me realize that this is actually a piece of reality about the way we explore the oceans today that people don't realize, right? We don't all get to go down in Alvin and see things firsthand. Most of the ocean is not accessible by the sort of diving technology we have, right? I sample deep sea sediments with sediment cores that, bring back this tiny little cylinder of the seafloor. I never get to see the seafloor that I sample. I have imagery based on sound and bathymetry, but I have to imagine if that seafloor is flat or tilted or rocky. And so only the very essence of what the surrounding environment might be like that we get from this game is very much like what modern oceanographers experience when they go looking into the deep ocean, because we don't get to be there. everything is remote, whether it's through an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle, or ship-based imagery, which is by definition fuzzy, or we don't see it at all, and we, trust to our sampling equipment to go down and get what we need and come back. So that was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I've been thinking that it's like, it's an imaginative challenge to the player in a way, and it reminds me a little bit more of like a tabletop role-playing game, or of course early text adventures and MUDs and like other games that just require you to do a little I don't know, theater of the mind or whatever, and kind of there is something nice about, I think, having to imagine what all of these organisms look like with pretty limited visual information. And I don't know, I found that challenging. I feel like my visual imagination is a little bit stunted in some ways, but hearing what you were saying, Hilairy, makes me appreciate more that that's something that scientists are having to do anyway, is kind of construct a vision of an ocean landscape or whatever, underwater landscape from data that isn't terribly visually rich.
I think that's also why people are very excited when we do get that occasional high resolution imagery from someplace where we've never been, right? Everybody knows about the research we do with Alvin because it has those beautiful camera images of hydrothermal vents and the environments around them.
Yeah.
People don't know what all the rest of the bottom of the ocean looks like.
I think an interesting aspect of this also is that, like, because the visuals aren't given to you, you're forced to kind of make analogies to organisms that we already know about on Earth to help you imagine what these alien creatures would look like. So there's all these parallels like drawn to other organisms, right? Like especially fungus in this game. Yeah.
So that actually gets us to another kind of big, I think, element of this that we've touched on a little bit, but I want to get into more, which is ecology. So a lot of the kind of action and, as Lisa put it, sort of light puzzle solving in this game is about exploring aquatic ecology. So you observe and sample different species. Hilairy names them, these kind of evocative names. They're actually, I think that was really helpful, Lisa, kind of metaphorical, or sometimes drawing analogies to earthly species and things like that, or onomatopoeias, things like that. And so we're trying to figure out, how these species interact and like what this alien ocean is really all about, because the environment's so opaque at first. So I guess for both of you, like, how does the game for you frame ecology, and like, how does that maybe help us think about ocean ecology back here on Earth? Because this is an alien ocean, but I think it's hard not to start connecting it back to our own oceans here.
Well, it's definitely very taxonomic, right? There's this sense of, I'll say, kind of early exploration where you go out and you enumerate the organisms that are there, right? And you collect them, right? There's a sense that there's you collect organisms, you take them back, you put them in their little boxes. I imagine them each with a pin in the middle of them, holding them down like beetle collections in a museum. But then there's analysis, and there's kind of trying to systematize and put things together in different categories. And, if you hadn't taken a biology class and remembered sort of all the taxonomic rules and structures, you would find yourself thinking, oh, do I actually have to know this, or is it going to tell me what I need?
Yeah.
And there is even before, how much can I tell people about what they see in the game?
I think we can talk about everything up until like big plot twists late in the game,
okay,
probably. But
no plot.
Eventually, if it's not going to ruin like the last third, maybe, or something like that. I haven't gotten
to the last third, so I can't do it.
I think we're in bounds on kind of some early turns, so we can give a sense of what
so you eventually build out something that leads you to a sketch of an organism, and it is a gorgeous kind of pen and ink drawing type sketch, not some computer, rendition of an image, which is lovely. And I admit I had a little, I won't say trouble. I was perpetually caught up in the sort of collecting character of this. It was sort of like stamp collecting. And when you think about ecology now, that is very different from the way we study organisms, right? We think about them as ecosystems and how they interact with each other. And the game gets to that, but at least in the early stages, and I admit I'm stuck in one spot on the game right now.
I got stuck a couple times early on too.
You get this impression that it's like, okay, if I just collect enough of these things, I will figure out how to use them.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that's not entirely true.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting tension, Hilairy, between that, you know, the discrete dynamics of putting things into a taxonomy, and then the overall conceit of the game and the mystery within it is something that like deeply revolves around an ecology, right? Like things being connected, non-human communication networks, you know, throughout this between different species. And that's like a central part of the narrative and the mystery, is figuring that system out. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it seems like, you know, there's a familiarity to the collecting aspect, I think. As someone who's played a lot of games in which you systematically collect things, you know, it's got like the sort of Pokemon aspect of it. But yeah, I think that is a really interesting tension within this game. This, you know, and ocean science too, which has to be attentive to fluidities and connections between things, right? I'm sure Hilairy could speak more on that. But yeah, I think that really does describe kind of the central experience of the game.
I want to prompt you on something that we did talk about when we were sort of preparing, which is that the idea that part of the ecological logic, I guess, of the game is that there's communication among all these different organisms, and that you both need to observe what those mechanisms are, and those actually make up that idea of information exchange and sort of reactions to different kinds of signals from organisms, whether it's like a sound or ripples in the water or something, is actually an important part of the way the game kind of like makes ecology and interspecies connections concrete. But then you're also sort of like piggybacking on that communication to do certain things. So I wonder if you all could talk about kind of this focus on communication and information exchange, but in these non-human networks that you're encountering and then sometimes jumping into.
So from the science standpoint, right, chemotaxis, the ability to sort of sense and respond to chemical cues, or how, you know, large organismal systems interact with each other is right at the forefront of research, right? We do not understand how that works. And yet we know it happens, right? We can see evidence for it. We clearly can imagine systems in which if you damage one part of that system, the rest of it knows, it responds, whether that's in a way to try to protect itself or to move or whatever. And that's definitely, you know, that is modern 21st century biology. And so that is firmly embedded in this game, even in the face of this sort of older, you know, older school exploratory, non-visual kind of frame of reference, which is cool. But we very much do not understand exactly how it works. And for that to be a key element of how to understand this environment, to me was really, I found myself saying, I know there's something about how this is happening. I don't know how it works. Nobody knows how this works. And yet here it is in this game.
Yeah, and just to piggyback onto that, you know, we discussed previously like what types of organisms these fictional organisms kind of remind us of, right? And there's, I think it's very interesting that like there are animals, I think, in the game, but primarily what we're looking at is, you know, fungus, plant-like organisms, like, you know, forests of things, and there's an aspect of like a defamiliarization there, but also I think it's important that they chose to model like a a non-human communication network on plants and fungus as opposed to animals, which we overwhelmingly privilege, right? Like, charismatic animals like whale communication or whatever. So yeah, and to respond to part of what you asked about, Joey, like the player in the game, there is that kind of biotechnological premise in the game too, where you're like also participating in some way in this communication network, or you're constantly using the organisms in ways that like mimic what their natural communication mechanisms are. And that's very interesting as well, is thinking about how the player also gets integrated into that system.
So I wonder if we could take a side path into talking a little bit about technology, like sort of some of the technologies we've been talking about that are used to sense aquatic and oceanic environments. And especially because this game kind of plays in the space between ocean exploration right here on Earth as we know it, and then space exploration. And it's appropriate because both of you, I think, are interested in astrobiology. And I know, Hilairy, that's one of your many hats. So as I've learned more about this from you two, like I know there's crossovers between space exploration and ocean exploration technology, funding streams, techniques. So I'm wondering what these crossovers are like, especially in light of the game. Like, is there something to be learned from this exchange of information and methods between space exploration and underwater exploration? We've talked a bit about how kind of dangerous and contingent this is, how much the explorer relies on her suit. That strikes me as an interesting nodal point. But yeah, how does that crossover of this game being a space and astrobiology game, but also an ocean exploration game, help us think differently?
So if I could jump in.
Please do.
One thing that comes to mind, right? This suit that walks around and does things has all the hallmarks of a rover, right? If you think about the rovers that are currently on Mars, driving around, collecting samples, analyzing them, sending information back, they get driven by people here on Earth, right? They're actually in control rooms like the one in ISTB4, and they talk by computer to the rover. It takes them a few hours to get a message to the rover. Then the rover has to do what they told it to do, and they can't see where the rover is. It figures something out and it sends a message back. That same concept of a human or an AI interface telling a mechanical object to go do something, figure it out, send back information is directly translated from the game, but also to the way we, deploy remotely operated vehicles in the ocean too, right? In the ocean, some of them are joystick controlled, right? You can actually make them do things directly to what you do with your hands. But some of them are, you tell the computer, pick this thing up. And so I think there's a lot of really direct connection to the way we explore things remotely, both in the ocean and for what we're doing in terms of planetary exploration right now.
So a couple things for those listening. ISTB4 is the Interdisciplinary Science and Technology Building 4, which is a building on ASU's campus where we have some of the space exploration technology, and where you're probably sitting in that building, right?
Yes.
Additionally, yeah, Hilairy, I think that your point makes a direct connection to the game's mechanisms, or the game's like kind of mechanics and controls, because you are often the basic movement mechanic, if you're using a controller and mouse, is to like hit a button to scan and then hit another button to pick among a few points. You can use the mouse for this sometimes if you want, and sort of to tell the suit to travel from point to point. Sometimes it can't go and you'll get an error message and you'll have to do something to clear a blockage or something. But there is some sort of like relay, I guess, between you, the human operator, the human in the game, and then the suit in the game. And those messages are getting passed back. And there's these little, they're very small delays, but there's these little delays where the little Doppler goes out and where you're actually seeing the dot that represents your character and their suit moving from place to place. So I think that is not just inherent in like the interface kind of logic of the game, but also like literally the kind of temporal experience of the game, and the way that you're using kind of button controls and not necessarily like total immersion, 3D walking around.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think what's striking about this game in comparison to other ocean games that I've played is precisely this like conceit of control at a distance, you know, as opposed to being embodied, you know, being a diver.
Mm.
And it, you know, it reminds me, or what I'm thinking of is that the history of you know, the way that we've observed remote spaces in the ocean, you know, is this kind of progressive movement towards autonomous sensing, you know, control at a distance, as opposed to early modes of, you know, earlier modes of knowing ocean spaces, which involved more of the sampling, taking direct samples type of stuff, I think. So yeah, I think that it gives us again, you know, that technological perspective, or that cyborg perspective, as we had mentioned earlier. There's a great ethnographer named Stefan Helmreich who talks about this, the specificity of how oceanographers experience moving through ocean space, and the importance of that sound interface also in structuring that subjectivity. So yeah.
So I wonder, I actually think that connects to something else that I wanted to talk about, which is, I guess, the history and iconography of exploration. So if I can jump ahead a little bit, something I thought we'd get to later, but that this control at a distance differs from the kind of like Jacques Cousteau model, right? The like, you know, fairly unprotected diver exploring in a fairly analog way. And this also, I think, ties into the way that like you see undersea documentaries. Some of them, you know, I think emphasize the technological apparatus, but others I think try to really like get you into the, you know, the sort of Shark Week, the, you know, photorealism and sort of like a very immediate kind of like quick panning, lots of edits, camera movements, making it feel like you're really immediate, like you're really in the ocean. Perhaps you're even in danger in some way. There's all these creepy fish with like, you know, giant teeth and lanterns coming off them there in the deep ocean. I don't know, is there something about like the way this game is either drawing on that history of lone exploration, but also maybe complicating it and trying to tweak it, undermine it, update it in some way? There's probably also some other examples other than Cousteau. You can tell that like my knowledge of this goes about an inch deep.
Well, you know, that frontier narrative is very compelling, right? Like the hero explorer figure. And you know, this is the part about the game that is not very realistic. In that oceanographic expeditions are run by large crews of people. You know, a lot of people have to help out to make these expeditions happen. But in the history books, we do kind of have sort of this great white man storyline of like the individual Western hero explorer figure, whether that was Jacques Cousteau or like people before that, like John Ernest Williamson, who really did develop these kind of mythologies around themselves purposely. And that can be frustrating, right? Because it erases the contributions of so many people who make ocean observation possible. So this game, you know, it might be problematic in that sense. But that being said, I think it is making an attempt to be progressive in a way by also having this female xenobiologist searching for another female xenobiologist, and there's like a light suggestion that they might have a relationship. So, you know, I see that as also like an attempt outside of the realism of the game at, you know, bringing in some socially progressive ideas.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, when we talk about the history of ocean exploration, right, you can point to the expeditions are named for the expedition leaders, right? The Cook expeditions, right? We all remember Cook. We do not remember, you know, the 50 or so other people who were on the ship with him, who actually did the hard work of going into, you know, from a Western perspective, uncharted forests and realizing that, these were dangerous places because they'd never seen, the kinds of bears or whatever. But we remember Cook, and we don't remember that there were teams of people. And that is true for all the science that we do now. So I really do appreciate that there are these aspects that feel a little bit more modern, that feel like it's trying to set that image aside a little bit. But it still retains that very much I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. I hate it when that happens. But the intrepid explorer character, right? And I think the game wouldn't be the same if you were, a research team where there were 6 or 8 of you all highly specialized doing your own thing from a game perspective.
Yeah, I think, it is interesting to think about this in terms of that this is a one-person studio. Ironically, video games are usually these broadly collaborative enterprises, and this is like, Gareth Damian Martin did almost 100% of the work on this game, which is staggering. It does. I mean, I think there's probably like a ton of good narrative reasons why it makes sense to keep that myth. And I think the actual, like what we talked about to sort of ribbon back to what we talked about to start off with, I think some of this distancing and sort of aggressive mediation does kind of disrupt, for me anyway, some of that kind of like heroic lone explorer thing. Because it's not like, the person in the skin suit with the oxygen tank just like floating down. And, Hilairy Voss is so dependent. I mean, she can't even move by herself, right? She needs the mediation of the technological apparatus that makes the mission happen. But then at the same time, the story doesn't extend to include the people who got her to that planet, which is presumably a big team, right? Like, how do you get to a Gliese 677cc? Probably takes a lot of people to get up there. So it's interesting of like the way that when you're working in a genre, the genre kind of like gives you, I don't know, a rubric to clip the story down to, and in this case, it's clipped down to this kind of ocean explorer story, which I think it has a troubled relationship with, but it still retains a lot of the DNA.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So we were talking earlier about, we've got a couple more questions. We've had a couple questions, I should say, from folks who are listening in that are quite good, and I'm looking forward to getting to them. And if anybody else wants to send in questions, I welcome you to do that, because we're going to turn to those very shortly. But really quickly, this is a big question, but I want to make sure we at least touch on it. How does the game deal with the effects of research and discovery, scientific research and discovery on environments? We talked a bit about the ways that the game invites you to kind of intercede in ecosystems or kind of piggyback on communication networks that you observe. So you are altering things. Then there's bases being built in this ocean. You both find them and then you contribute to their expansion. So did you think the game sees humans as interlopers or something else? Does it take seriously the way that people encroaching into previously unexplored spaces might change those spaces or alter the observations that we're able to make?
Oh, go ahead, Hilairy.
Oh, sorry. So what I found is that because there is this collection component to it, and because in the backstory that there's a large corporation, right?
Yeah.
And that this is an exoplanet, a planet around another star. So there was a major sort of effort to get there. There is this kind of go see, extract kind of character about it, right? You could frame that all the way back to a very classical kind of colonial view of exploration on Earth. And at the same time, at least as far as I've gotten in the game, and admittedly I'm stuck at one point, it's not like they're building, little stock extractors or anything like that. So it's not overt, but you do think about it now and then.
Yeah, I definitely found this to be like a central aspect of the game, or thing that I thought about of the game. So like, in physics, you acknowledge observer effects, right? Like the way that the very act of observing can disturb the system that you're trying to understand. And in media studies, it's a similar way of thinking about like observation and mediation. And we see an image on a screen or in a database, and those texts don't speak for themselves. Human beings are interpreting and framing and speaking for those images. And so what I think is cool about this game is how like we are actively embedded in ecological transformations. Our role as observers isn't passive. It's an active intervention into what we see. And I do think the game is smart about that. It's ocean exploration is not like this seamless, frictionless activity. And part of that has to do with the convergences between science and industry, or the corporatization of science. And so like, while in the mechanics, you are using organisms to do things, there's this kind of like instrumentalist perspective on nature. But that being said, I think the game is ultimately very self-aware of that, and does reflect, not to give too much away, it does reflect on the ethics of that, of how, a anthropocentric technological perspective on nature can also go wrong in other ways.
Mhm. I think there's also an element of which, and you alluded to this in your introduction to me, Joey, this idea that, we now live in a world where humans impact the earth in ways that we can document and study, right? We are arriving at a science, an earth science, that does not set humans apart as separate from the system that we are studying, right? We are studying an inhabited planet. We are studying and I use this word lightly and in quotes, an intelligent planet, right? Because we are actually doing that. It's not just sort of meta. It is, in fact, we are studying ourselves. And this game has a bit of a sense that we are in the system that the game is exploring. And that is in contrast to sort of classical 19th century exploration in ecology, right? Where we imagine that we could go study something and not change it, right? As if you could build a boardwalk through your wetland and study your wetland without having changed it, even though now there's a boardwalk there.
Yeah. Well, and even the way that as we've alluded to a few times, the game, even early on, like the simplest puzzle is like you use these shrill sacks to open, you make these other fungal stalks, basically. I think they are retract so you can get through areas. Those areas remain open, and it's not like dwelled on too much, but when you make these small changes that I think you could read as reversible, or that will sort of recede over time, maybe those fungal pillars will sort of, they'll I don't know what's the opposite of retract. They'll come back out.
I've learned that if you're super slow and you go back to some place where you removed a bunch of stalks,
so they do.
They come back.
Okay, so that's good to know. That's
take them out again.
But there's this idea that like you're clearly leaving your marks in the environment. And actually, again, to get to genre, there is a little bit of a chase narrative here, which I think Lisa alluded to. And so the idea of chasing someone suggests that they're leaving marks behind. And so there is something like inescapable in this sort of staging of the narrative that says like, well, these are people who are trotting through the environment, and they're actually leaving enough behind that like you can follow their tracks. And so that suggests something, aside from all of the like later game reveals, like there is something kind of just built in that it doesn't make you an sort of invisible and disembodied camera just taking pictures of something that you're not touching.
Absolutely. I mean, there's this, you're moving from ruined landscape to ruined landscape essentially in this game. And so this sort of brings up a conversation that is frequently discussed in the environmental humanities, which is the idea of a nature culture separation, right? The tendency for us to like think of those things as, being separate, or think of environmentalism as being primarily an act of preserving wild nature, as opposed to figuring out how human beings and non-human nature can form meaningful kinships together, right? Or can move forward, like, or can embrace the ruined landscapes, which is an intervention that environmental humanist named Anna Singh has made. And so I think, yeah, that's an interesting aspect of the game as well, is that I do think it places some value on like what it means to inhabit a world that is quote unquote already ruined, right? Without it being, an apocalyptic narrative necessarily.
Yeah. So,
Or it just
go
to
ahead,
jump
Hilairy,
in,
please. Yes, please.
I like that framing of a ruined landscape, but it's also, if you take a step away from it, there's nothing wrong with this landscape. It's fully inhabited by all of these creatures and organisms and systems, but it's not habitable to Hilairy Voss or to, and if you're only the AI suit, in principle, it isn't anything at all, right? It's not interpretable as either habited or uninhabited or habitable or uninhabitable, except through the lens of the human and the suit. But the stalks and the plants and everything else are pretty happy for the most part, at least in the section of the game that I'm in.
Yeah. So before we shift to questions from our audience, I did want to just ask, and this is sort of a stub of a larger conversation that we've had. What is it about oceans? I think this game appealed to all of us, and I ended up finding all of you. And I think this was Lisa's idea, but it seems appealing in part because it does involve exploring an ocean, and the beautiful colors and all of the imaginative imagery, and even those drawings that you find at certain points in the game, like those all draw on the kind of glamorous history of people's fascination with oceans. So what is it about the oceans, and like where does all that come from? Why do we care so much about them? Or like, why have we been made and cultivated to care so much about them?
So for me, the ocean really appeals to me because it has such deep ties to human histories as well as natural ones. It's kind of an archive of maritime trade routes, transatlantic slave trade, war, and of course, resource extraction. So it's a space that, it's not alien to us, even though it is. It's an important part of human culture and human history. And it's definitely an urgent part in terms of how we're conceptualizing human futures. The fate of the earth, to some degree, rests on how we treat our oceans, which are the lungs of the planet. So whether or not we, can remedy pollution and ocean warming and acidification and exploitation is part of how we're going to move forward, or how we hope to move forward in a sustainable way. And at the same time, there are all these sort of gathering storms, right? There's offshore drilling, there's geopolitical conflicts, deep sea mining, potential for more extinctions in our oceans. And so I think the game reflects that, those anxieties a lot of about how so much is resting on, our abilities to find ways of understanding and legislating and caring for ocean environments.
I completely agree with Lisa, and I'm just going to amplify a little bit from an earth sciences perspective. We are a water planet, right? We have 70% of the surface of the planet is covered with oceans. And there is hardly any culture in the world that doesn't have an ocean origin story, right? It is everywhere in human history. And as Lisa said, right, our future depends on us having our act together about the ocean. But on a more positive note, in a very long-term framework, remember I'm a geoscientist, everything we do to our atmosphere now, everything we do that's gonna mess up our climate, the ocean's gonna solve this problem. It's gonna take 10,000 years, but the ocean will re-achieve some kind of equilibrium that will suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. It will dissolve certain kinds of rocks at the seafloor. But the ocean is a giant, giant homeostatic control on our planet. And whether we're here or not. And so when we say the planet will survive, it's because of the way the oceans work. It's because of how the oceans distribute heat and all of the things that in our day-to-day lives, we don't think about. But our planet is an ocean planet. And I think there's something very core to that in the way people imagine the ocean.
Okay, so thank you both for that. I think we could have just talked about just that question for the entire hour. So I have a couple of questions I want to field from our audience before we say farewell. So the first one is from Catherine, who is a former speaker in this series. So hi, Catherine. So she asks, have any of you encountered the accompanying book with illustrations of the organisms? This is totally new information to me that there's a book. I'm curious about what you make of this other way of mediating science fictional science with less of an interface effect and more of a sense of the 19th century illustrator scientific situation. This is kind of connected, Hilairy, to that the point where you find the pen and ink images, and right, it's a totally different register, visual register. So what do you make of this potentially vis-a-vis Lisa's point about the non-representational elements of organisms in the game? So there's this whole other thing going on, and I didn't actually know about it all in the universe of this game, which is like this book, which draws on, again, I mean, this gets us to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago about like how it's both drawing on and then in some ways refusing, I think, this kind of 19th century heroic history. So I don't know if y'all have thoughts about that, or, you know, sort of reflections if there's this whole other text that's living alongside the game.
I had no idea this existed. I think it'd be interesting to see. I mean, in some ways, I'm glad that I didn't know it existed, because I think it made, you know, the imaginative fictional text elements of the game more evocative. But, you know, it would certainly be on some level a reflection of real scientific activity at a certain time, I'm sure.
Yeah.
One thing that I haven't seen the book, but as I read that question, the first thing that came to mind was Ernst Haeckel, who was a 19th century zoologist and artist who did some of the most beautiful illustrations of relatively big single-celled organisms, right? He could see through a microscope. He drew beautiful drawings and paintings of these things. And so in my head, it's going to look like that, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it does raise this whole idea that marine organisms are beautiful, partly because they are so adapted to their environment. And it's an environment we don't live in, that we can't imagine, right? We don't have fins and filter feeding capabilities. And much of what we see in science fiction in terms of what aliens look like are often things that we do see examples of in marine organisms, the most alien things we can find on Earth.
Yeah. I think there's this, the game Mass Effect is getting kind of remastered, re-released. I think it was like today, yesterday, you know, it's like this week, there's this big remaster of this very popular space opera franchise. And like so many of the humanoid alien companions that you know, make common cause with in that game totally have like these aquatic sort of physiologies. They have fins or gills or just like, you know, the kinds of eyes you often see on ocean creatures. When you said that, Hilairy, it immediately made me think like, oh, so many of the beloved characters for me in that game are like, you know, they have these kind of oceanic elements to their physiology. And that's what makes them both like seem alien, but also seem somewhat recognizable, I think. Like they're on that horizon of sensibility for you. It also, you know, it reminds me, we're doing this transmedia storytelling project book that we're starting to work on at our center, and like that these games, the indie video games, often exist in these transmedia universes, and they have social media followings and fan art, and they have these, some of them have Kickstarter campaigns to fund them, and they'll have, you know, things like books or other kind of paratexts that get created for as Kickstarter rewards. And it creates this whole other universe that often has really different aesthetics. So like when fans start to illustrate properties, games and things like that, they often use completely different aesthetics than the game developers choose themselves, which is very interesting. And it's especially interesting in this case because of the like sort of rich historical grounding of all the imagery as we've been talking about. Lisa, anything to add before we jump to the next question?
Oh, I'm ready to answer this next question if we want to.
Okay, good. No, do you want to introduce it and answer it? Something for us to take.
We could talk about the Anthropocene all day.
Oh my gosh, I know. Yeah, I mean, the history of like kind of rapacious corporations, extractive corporations in science fiction futures, and of course, Alien is such a good example of this. That whole franchise is something we could definitely discuss for an hour. One of the many discussions that could be an entire hour out of this. I want to just say now that we're up on the hour. Thank you so much, Hilairy and Lisa, for joining me today. This was so much fun.
This was
and
great.
thank you. I'm gonna put in chat what I'm about to say, which is you can learn more about Lisa and her work at lisayinhan.wordpress.com, and you can learn more about Hilairy at candylab.weebly.com, and you can find out more about In Other Waters and Gareth Damian Martin, the game's creator, at jumpovertheage.com. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination, as always, for making this Skill Tree event possible, and especially to Tyler Eglin, who, as always, has run the tech very ably for us and edited the gameplay videos down from the like very large amount of footage that we captured. We'll be hosting more CSI Skill Tree events later this summer. I'm planning our next one for July. To be notified about episodes, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter at ImaginationASU, and visit our website, csi.asu.edu. So thank you once again to Lisa and Hilairy for being here and for sharing their insights and wisdom and experience. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks, Lisa.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Bye, everybody.
Bye.